Good afternoon, everyone. I hope everyone had a great Thanksgiving break. Welcome to the webinar. The webinar is differentiating instruction, how to facilitate mixed ability ESL classes. And today we have with us Katie Welch. So I'm going to turn it over to Katie and everybody enjoy the webinar. Thanks so much.
Well, hello, everyone. Let me get my screen pulled up and we'll get started today. I'm so glad that you're here. And I see we've got people joining us from all over, from Portland, Maine to New York City, all the way to Montrose, Colorado. So welcome, welcome. So today we're going to be talking about differentiating instruction, specifically in ESL classrooms, although many of the things we talk about would be relevant to a GED or other adult ed classroom as well. I am Katie Welch and just want to tell you a little bit about me. I have a background in linguistics and focus on language acquisition and learning. And so we'll be talking about not so much about linguistics today, but definitely how we facilitate learning as we are acquiring a second language. I do a lot in the ESL world. I'm located down here in Dallas, Texas, and serve on our executive board of our local Tex TESOL affiliate. I work as a university instructor and also as a teacher trainer. But the thing I would like you to know more than anything is that I am also a teacher. Even though I work with a lot of teachers, I think it's really important to stay in the classroom so that you don't forget how difficult it is to differentiate instruction and to meet the needs of all learners. And so I teach in my community as a volunteer, as a GED teacher and an ESL teacher. And so I'm bringing that kind of real world experience with me today to our webinar. I've also taught in higher ed, and currently teach in higher ed and have taught in K-12 as well. So that's a little bit about me. I want to talk about our topic for today, and I want to define some terms first before we get going. And that is the difference between a multi-level classroom and a mixed ability classroom. So these are similar concepts, but when we talk about a multi-level classroom, often what we mean is that you have multiple English proficiency levels together in the same room. Originally, when I gave this presentation at COABE conference, it was sponsored by Cambridge. And so just as an example, if you were using Ventures curriculum, this would apply to any curriculum, but if you were using Ventures in a multi-level classroom, you would have, for example, students working out of level 1, maybe level 2, maybe even level 3, all together in the same classroom. And that can be very challenging when you are trying to teach from 3 different workbooks at the same time. So multi-level classroom, often students are using different levels of the curriculum simultaneously. In a mixed ability classroom, this is when usually you've done some sort of an assessment and you have determined that the students are roughly the same English proficiency level. And so they would all be working out of the same workbook, theoretically. Now, almost every class I've ever taught, I've been teaching for about 20 years at all levels, and almost every class I've ever taught has been a mixed ability classroom. Even if we have great assessments, in fact, one of the GED classes that I'm working in right now, we have a great assessment trying to see which track the students need to be in. And my students have taken a reading assessment and come to me all basically at the same level in reading. And yet what I find is in writing, when we go to work on that GED essay, they're all over the map. And I have some that are very proficient in writing and others that are not. So even in the same classroom, even if you do an assessment to make sure that you're more or less targeting the same group of students at the same level, you're going to find that there are different needs within your classroom. So today I'm going to be focusing more on mixed ability classrooms than I am on multi-level. Everything that I say today would apply to both contexts. But if you're teaching multi-level or you're trying to teach English learners that are working out of different workbooks, there's just another that's just another level of complexity that's added. And so if you have questions specifically about multi-level classrooms, put those in the chat for me and we can talk about them at the end. But for now, I'm going to move forward with talking about mixed ability classrooms. What is it when you have students who are all roughly at the same level and yet have very different needs? In that case, it's very important that we talk about how do you differentiate for your learners. Differentiation is a concept that has been conceptualized and popularized by Carol Ann Tomlinson. Tomlinson is a professor at the University of Virginia, and her work is really largely geared towards K-12 instruction. And so here's a couple of the books that she's written. She's written many. And so what we do is we take some of these great concepts about differentiation from Tomlinson, but the question is, how do you apply them into an adult ed context? How do you apply them into adult learners who are learning English? And so that's my challenge for today. That's my goal for today, is to think about how do we take Tomlinson's work and apply it into the context where you're teaching. First, just so that we can make sure we're all on the same page, differentiation, we want to define it and say what it is and also what it isn't. And so Tomlinson here defines it as a teacher attending to the learning needs of a particular student or small groups of students, rather than teaching a class as though all individuals in it were basically alike. In essence, Tomlinson is saying that we do not want a one-size-fits-all teaching in any of our classrooms. And we want to instead think about how we can think about the learning needs of individuals and small groups within our classroom. Tomlinson goes on to define 3 types of differentiation. And so I want to go through each type. And I also want to tell you how in my own classroom, how I've employed these types of differentiation. And so the first type is in content. Differentiation in content is when you are varying the input, that is what students learn. And so as an example, in one of my classes, it was really important that my students know how to use the library. And some of my students had been using the library for years. They knew exactly how to go to the library and check out a book. And others, it was their very first time ever knowing anything about a library. And so I realized that I was going to need to have a lesson for 1 week of my class on library skills, basically, how to use the library. But I realized that to differentiate for the needs of my learners, that I had half the class that were going to be very bored if I gave them a library 101 kind of course. And I had half the class that desperately needed just a basic primer on the library. And so what I realized was I needed to differentiate in content. And so that particular week, I had 2 different lessons created. One was a lesson on, the basics, and one was a little bit more advanced. And so that's an example of differentiating content on actually what students learn. And again, if you're in that multi-level context where you have different students working out of workbook level 1, workbook level 2, et cetera, then the differentiating in content is really critical. But there's other types of differentiation as well. And the second type is going to be differentiation in process. And this is how students go about making sense of ideas and information. And so in another course at another time, I was teaching about verbs, everyone's favorite topic. And I was trying to explain the difference between action verbs and linking verbs. And my students were just not getting it. I'm sure you've had classes before where you are teaching and you just realize that your students are not with you. And I had recognized that. And I thought, how can I help teach this in a way that they can understand? And so I had this idea that I was going to make a map. And it was colorful, and there was a car, and they were going to stop at Ox's auto station for auxiliary verbs, and they were going to go to Main Street for the main verbs and linking lane for the linking verbs. This is giant metaphor. And you see up here, there are lots of arrows and colors and houses and things. And so this is how I taught this lesson about verbs. Well, some of my students, the light bulb went off. They said, aha, I get it, finally. Others said, this is too many colors. I don't get it. I don't understand. The way that they were processing the information, this was not reaching them. And so what I realized was I need to teach the same thing in a different way. And so I redid this kind of flow chart into a black and white version down at the bottom that was real simple. It's kind of yes, no questions that students could follow, trying to figure out what type of verbs they were looking for. And so this is a way to differentiate process, how they go about making sense of information. And then the third type that Tomlinson put forth about differentiation was differentiation by product. And this is actually what students produce, their output, how they show what they know, how they demonstrate what they have learned. And so in another class, at another time that I was teaching, I wanted my students to share their ideas on a topic, and they were kind of brainstorming their ideas. And some of my students really preferred to type out their ideas, and others, that was not the way that they wanted to be able to think through, to show me how they were thinking about this topic. And so instead, of just saying everyone has to type, I differentiated by product by allowing some to do the assignment in a written format and others to do the assignment in a spoken format. And I used a tool that I love called Flip, which is an app, a free app available to teachers where students can record themselves speaking. And it's so great when you're teaching English learners and they might be reluctant to speak in class. And so I have them record themselves speaking, but I differentiated in product. They could do the written or the speaking. Now, that doesn't always work in English classes. Obviously, if the goal is that I need to be able to assess everyone's speaking, or I want to see what you've learned in terms of your speaking ability, then obviously I need everyone to be doing the speaking. But in a situation like this, where I just more was trying to get their opinion about something, and it really didn't matter if it was written or spoken, then I could offer a choice. So these are the three types of differentiation. My favorite metaphor about differentiation is that of a mountain. We talked about what differentiation is, but we also want to talk about what it is not. It is not expecting less of our students. In terms of the mountain, we think about our classrooms that we are all climbing a mountain together. We are all trying to reach the top. And that doesn't change regardless of the ability of your students or their readiness. Everyone's headed to the top. We're not changing our expectations for the students, but how we reach that summit, that top of the mountain, is going to look different for different learners. I'm down here in Texas where it is very, very flat. And so if I were to climb a mountain, I would need a lot of support because I'm not used to doing that every day. Some of you probably live in parts of the country where you are a lot more accustomed to changes in elevation than we are down here in Texas. But there's going to be different routes up the mountain. And some of them are going to be very direct. They might be very steep. Some of them might be long and windy. Some of them might take more time to get to the top of the mountain, but everyone's headed to the same place together. But we might need different supports to get there. If you look at this picture of these folks who are hiking, you'll notice that not everyone has the same supports. Some people have walking sticks. That's something they need to get up the mountain. Some people have different types of shoes, hiking shoes versus tennis shoes, etc. Some people, like myself, might even need some canned oxygen to make it all the way to the top because they might be struggling a lot. And so this is a great picture of a differentiated classroom, is that we're all headed in the same direction, but we may need different tools to get there. We may need different levels of support. And so you might be thinking at this point, wow, that sounds like a lot of work, because it is. Differentiated classrooms are very difficult to implement. And in fact, it's better if we start kind of small and slow because it is that challenging. And so when we think about differentiation, it would be nice if we had an easy button. Do you remember this commercial? This was a commercial from, goodness, I don't even know when, how long ago it was, but it was when Staples, the office supply company, came out with this idea of an easy button. I'm going to play a little bit of the commercial, see if you remember this one.
So n equals what, Josh?
Today we'll be performing a triple Hoffenloser procedure.
But you've never done that before.
That's okay.
So we see all of these different people who are in difficult situations and they're pushing the easy button and all of a sudden it's great. It would be so nice if we had an easy button for differentiation. And while I don't necessarily have an easy button to mail to your house to make it to where all you have to do is push the button and it's done, I do have today 4 ideas about how to make facilitating a differentiated class easier. And so the first one is going to be to don't do it alone. We're not going to do this alone. The second one is going to be that we're going to use flexible groups. The third is we will differentiate our activities. And the fourth, and really important, is that we're going to foster student buy-in. Before we move on and start going through each of these 4 easy buttons, and you'll see here's our first one, is don't do it alone. I wanted to pause because I saw in the chat, I mentioned the Flip app, and there was some discussion that Flipgrid, it was called Flipgrid for years, and just real recently they changed to just Flip, and so they've shortened it. And it is a free app that's available where you can have students record themselves speaking. And what I love about it is, besides it being free, is that if you have a student that's shy and maybe doesn't want to record themselves on the camera, it can do voice only. And it has lots of fun. It's similar to social media in that there's lots of stickers and filters and just things that make it more fun. And then it's a great way to capture your students' speaking ability. And also I always have my students pronounce their names for me on Flip at the beginning of every semester so that I can practice saying their names correctly. So just a quick little follow-up on Flip. Okay, but back to what we're talking about. Step 1 is don't do it alone if you want to do a differentiated classroom. Those of you that are teaching currently, a question that I have for you is, does your teaching ever feel like a one-man band or a one-woman show or a one-person party? Do you ever feel like Dick Van Dyke in the beginning of Mary Poppins? Whoops, let's go back, see if we can see Dick Van Dyke. Sometimes I feel like this is what teaching can be like when you have many needs in your classroom. You're trying to do it all. Some of you are saying in the chat, yeah, you relate to that. That is, you're trying to play every instrument and meet all of these needs. And it's how does one person do it all? And I think that's the challenge in differentiation, is thinking, how would I have time to think about each of the individual needs of my students? How do I have time to make different paths up the mountain, if you will? It's one of the challenges. And so it's the first thing we want to talk about. When we talk about learning in general, learning theories, Lev Vygotsky is a theorist that we think about quite a bit when it comes to learning. In the 1970s, he came up with a theory called the zone of proximal development. And this was the idea that students need assistance by a more knowledgeable other. More knowledgeable other is what he called it. We would usually just call a teacher. And there is this idea that there are some things that students can do on their own already without help. And there are some things that even with the best teaching in the world, a student just isn't ready for. They're just not there yet. And that's not really where a teacher can help. But there is a zone of proximal development where when a teacher comes alongside a student, that they can then learn. And so it kind of looks like this, where similar to the Goldilocks and the Three Bears, that if you give a student something that's too easy, that you won't have any growth. If you give them something too hard, they're just going to be frustrated because it's too difficult. But if you give them that just right teaching, that then they will learn. Just like the too cold, the too hot, and the just right. And so a lot of differentiation is trying to meet that zone of proximal development. It's trying to find that just right place for each student. But that can be, nearly impossible for the one-man band, the one-woman show of a teacher. And so instead, we want to try to not take on that responsibility on ourselves. The ZPD, Zone of Proximal Development, was later updated in 2004 to say that actually it's not all dependent on the teacher. That students can learn, they can meet their zone of proximal development without having a teacher standing right next to them, meeting their needs. In fact, they said that one way to learn is through assistance from a more capable other, like an adult, but also a more capable peer, someone who's a little bit further along in their learning can help assist a student. Interaction with equally capable peers. So that is, if you have someone that's kind of on the same ability level, that learning can take place there as well. Likewise, that if you happen to be working alongside someone who's less capable, that because we learn by teaching, that this is a scenario where learning can occur. And then we can actually learn on our own. We have our own inner resources that we can access when we do independent learning. And so this is kind of a relief for teachers because it's not necessarily all on us. We can leverage the resources in our classroom, including other students. And step one in differentiation is that we have to get to a place where our classrooms have this look and feel, not necessarily the bright colors and the bean bags, although that's fun, but this idea that the teacher is moved into a role as facilitator, as opposed to being the sole provider of knowledge and the one that every student is relying on to meet their needs at all times. So in this picture, you see, some students working by themselves. You see some students working in small groups, some working in pairs, etc. So step one is we don't want to go it alone. We want to leverage the other people that are the other resources in our classroom, which means that students can learn in a variety of situations. They can learn for sure on what's on the left-hand side here, which is the sage on the stage, that wise, all-knowing person that's up at the front teaching them. There's a place for that. But students can also learn when the teacher moves to that guide on the side role and is facilitating small groups. So that's step one, is our easy button, is just to make sure that we are leveraging other resources beyond just ourselves, because we can't do it all. But the next step of that is then to use flexible groups. And so this is kind of the key of differentiation, not just use groups, but use flexible groups. That's a key distinction that Tomlinson makes in her research. So what's a flexible group? Well, it is when students are working in a lot of different group configurations. They have this access to a wide variety of working arrangements. They're not always working with the same person every time or the same partner every time. And these groups can be based on many different criteria. It could be based on the student's interest. At one point, I had some students that loved music. And so it just made sense that they would work together on a project that involved interest. I might have students that are interested in soccer and they might work together. So it's not even necessarily on ability level, although it could be and sometimes is. So students are constantly moving into different grouping configurations based on what the teacher is trying to accomplish at that time. And these groups can be purposefully assigned. That is, you've given a lot of thought to who is working with whom, or it could just be randomly assigned where you don't know who's going to work with, who the partner is going to be, and that's okay. I like this resource here. This is available from teachthought.com. And it's just as a teacher thinks about putting together small groups in their class, you can kind of go through this checklist to think about, okay, well, why am I doing small groups right now? What are we trying to accomplish? How long are we going to use these groups? By what criteria am I grouping the students, et cetera? Am I choosing the groups for the students, or are they choosing their own groups? So it kind of helps you to think through some of these different things. Early on in my career teaching adults, I kind of used a very simple grouping strategy, which was turn to the person next to you. It took a long time for me to realize that I could do it a better way. And there were other ways that I could be helping students to climb up that mountain based on the group that they were in. So here are 5 different types of groups that you could use in your classroom. And again, all of these have a place. And so I want you to think, kind of as I'm talking through these in your own classroom, which of these do you utilize? Do you utilize all 5? Do you tend to preference one more than the other? The first one is, I don't know why that, hang on, let's go back. The first one is convenience groups. And so a convenience group is the one that I used very frequently when I was first teaching, which is just whoever the student happens to be sitting close to at the time, that's who they work with. It's convenient. And so I would just say, they just sat wherever they wanted to in my classroom. And if we were going to do groups, I would just say, turn to the person next to you. That's a convenience group, and definitely very easy. Another kind of group where the student chooses their partner is a self-selected group. And this is when you let the students pick their partner. Now, often when they do that, sometimes they will just choose the convenient person sitting next to them, but sometimes they have a friend across the room that they enjoy working with, or maybe someone that speaks their native language that they want to work with. And so, Dawn was saying sometimes she sees groups by first languages. So when students choose, they're going to choose based on familiarity. However, there are other ways to group as well. And I think this is the part that we want to talk more about. That third one, which is random groups, is when the teacher is selecting the group, but they're not strategically selecting the group. That is, they're not thinking, oh, I really want this person and that person to work together because they're on a similar level. They're just saying, I'm going to randomly cluster people together based on some sort of superficial thing. And so as an example, I see in the chat, we're talking about clock buddies, and we are just about to talk about clock buddies. So we're getting there. Thank you, Fane. Your advanced differentiation, you're 5 slides ahead of me. But that's a great, what you're suggesting is a great idea. But for random groups, there's lots of different ways to sort. You could use a sorting card, like the one that you see over here, that just has a color on the top and then a number and then a picture. These are just ways to randomize. So you can give everyone a sorting card and say all the purples get together, all the number 3s get together, everyone that has a diamond get together. So you can group that way. There are lots of online group generators. So if you just want the internet to do it for you, you can go to classtools.net, pickerwheel.com, and input your roster, and it will automatically generate groups for you. And so this is one way to randomize who works with whom. You can also use a large variety of what we call Kagan structures. Kagan is a name, and this is a group. They've written a book that gives all of these great ideas about how you get students into groups. And so one of them that maybe you used before is concentric circles, or what I call speed dating, where you put everyone in a line or a circle and they're 2 people are facing each other and they have a conversation, and then you move the line one person, and so now they have a new partner, and then you move the line again one person, and so ultimately they end up with lots of different conversation partners. One that I use a lot for randomly mixing my students, because it's easy, is stand up, hand up, pair up. And it's just where you literally stand up, put your hand in the air, and then high five someone, and that is your partner. One that I use a lot too is called quiz, quiz, trade, where everyone has a question that they're asking. And so they go find a random person, they ask their question, the other person answers, the other person asks their question, the first person answers, then they trade questions and head off to find a new partner. The trade is nice there. The reason why it's not just quiz, find a new partner, why you quiz, and then trade, is because on the trade, they are now given a new question to ask. And so they're using new language and not just the same thing over and over again. So anyway, lots of things, numbered heads together. There are many Kagan structures. You can Google this and find a million ways to do this. They also came up with something called a table mat, which I want to talk about because this concept is hard to accomplish in an adult ed classroom. And so, but I want you to understand the concept first, and then we'll talk about how do you modify it for adults. So in a K-12 classroom, and a lot of these Kagan structures, they're geared towards a K-12 audience. But in a K-12 classroom, you often have assigned seating. I know for me, with adults, I've never felt very comfortable assigning seats for my students. And so it's a little bit different for us teaching adults. But in K-12, you'll often see desks clustered together like the 4 that you see at the top there. And the mat, this mat goes in the middle of those 4 desks. And so because the mat is right there, then now you have a number 1 person, a number 2, a number 3, a number 4, but you also have the person that's next to you is considered your shoulder partner. They're the person that's right next to you, that if you turn to your right or to your left, that you would be facing them. And then the face partner, or sometimes called the eyeball partner, is the one that's sitting across from you. And so K-12 teachers will, as a way to group students, say, okay, turn to your shoulder partner, turn to your eyeball partner, your face partner. That's who I want you to work with. Now, because K-12 teachers have assigned seating, they have been very strategic about who is that person's shoulder partner and who is that person's face partner. And so they, a lot of times, will put someone that's a similar ability level as the shoulder partner when they want them, they know, okay, in this activity, I want my students to be working with someone that's on a similar level. And then when they want a challenge for their students, they will say, okay, turn to your eyeball partner, your face partner, and that's going to be the person that's on a different ability level. So in K-12, it's very strategic. Whereas for us in adult ed, because we don't have assigned seating usually, using something like this would still be very random. Last thing with random groups that you can do is when you create these groups, you can assign roles to the different people. And so even though they're random and you think I don't have a lot of control over who they're working with, or in this case, how they're getting up the mountain, with these group role cards, you do have the opportunity to provide scaffolds for students. And so what I might do is if I've randomly mixed my groups, I've used one of these random group generators, somehow we're in random groups, and I had no control over who was working with whom, but I then have group role cards. And as I go around, I can assign different roles to different people. And if I know that I have someone that's going to be particularly strong in writing, I may go ahead and assign them to be the scribe. If I have someone that I know is reluctant in speaking, what I may do is I may give them a card. For example, the voice monitor in this situation, it actually has some language in there for them. It says, I think we need to quiet down. Please, can you lower your voice a little? The teacher has asked that we bring down our volume. This may or may not be applicable to you, but what I want you to notice here is not so much about the voice monitor, but it's about the fact that the card has some scaffolding built into it. It has some help, some supports for that student. And so even if they're in a random group, if I know that that student may have a hard time contributing to their larger group, I may assign them a role and give them a card that's going to have some supports that will help them be successful in that role. So these are things you can do with random groups. But ultimately, in differentiation, the goal is to move to these last two, which is heterogeneous and homogeneous groups. And this is where the teacher is selecting the groups based on the skills and readiness and ability level of the students. And so these are teacher selected groups, and it's a heterogeneous group is going to mean that you're purposefully mixing abilities. And a homogeneous group is going to be where you are purposefully grouping different ability levels together to work together. And so one way that you can do this in your classes is to use what, I've forgotten who it was. Let's see. Fane was telling us about clock partners. Because we don't have assigned seating, again, we can't necessarily say turn to your shoulder partner because we don't know who that person is going to be. But we do want times where we know we are purposely matching our students with someone of a similar ability level or a different ability level. And so one way that you can do this with your students is to use a clock like this. And this is, you can grab this for free if you want to use this. But the way the clock partners works, this has nothing to do with time. When I first heard about these, I thought, okay, at 1 o'clock, this person is supposed to work with this person. At 2 o'clock, then I'm supposed to change and this person works with this person. It has nothing to do with the actual passage of time in your class. Instead, what it has to do with is just, you're going to say, go, at any point in your class, you could say, go find your 1 o'clock partner, and they can look on their clock and find, okay, who am I supposed to work at 1 o'clock? And I'm going to go find that particular person. Now, if you do a clock partner, the great thing is that you can hand your students a clock that's already pre-filled in. And so, for example, if this was my student Lily, and I knew that Lily and Raquel were very similar levels on speaking. They would be good partners together on a speaking task if I wanted them to be same level. And so I've already filled in that Raquel's, there's a really big Texas thunderstorm going on behind me. I don't know if you can hear it, but I apologize for that. But anyway, at 12 o'clock, if I want Raquel and Lily to work together, then I'm going to go ahead and pre-fill that in. And so those two I know are going to be similar level in speaking. Likewise, if I know that Lily and Dot are a similar level in writing, then I'm going to make them 5 o'clock partners. And then if I say, okay, we're about to do a writing task, everyone get with your 5 o'clock partner, then I know that I have paired my students with someone who is going to be a good partner for them for that particular task. If I want to do a different, perhaps I want someone who is strong in writing and someone who's struggling in writing. Joan said she can't hear the storm. My screen just flashed, so we're just all going to hope that we can keep internet. I'm going to keep going unless someone tells me that I'm not with you anymore. But our 6 o'clock partner for Lily is going to be Josue, because I know that Josue is really strong in writing, and I know that Lily is still struggling in writing, and I know that they're going to work well together because maybe Lily can orally say what she's wanting, and Josue can be the scribe. Maybe that's what I need for that particular situation. I might go ahead and fill in Sai and Camera and all these different ones that I've kind of stacked the deck in my favor. So that way, as I think about these students all getting up the mountain, I have decided who are they going to work best with, and I have preloaded, predetermined who that should be. But then I may give them the clock with some not filled out, and I might say, okay, I want you to go find somebody who has the same native language as you. And I want that to become your 1 o'clock partner. And so they'll go find someone and fill in the blank of, okay, I know that this person is also a Spanish speaker. I'm a Spanish speaker, so I'm going to put their name there. And so then if you want students to work in groups where they have the same native language, you can say, everyone go find your 1 o'clock partner, and they can look on their clock and find who that is. You can do number 2, 2 o'clock, it might be same interest, everyone that likes soccer or Pokemon or something, whatever it is that they're interested in. Or maybe they're working in the same career, maybe the same field. You could do a free choice. That way they can still work with their friends. So just find somebody that you want to work with. That could be their 3 o'clock partner. Maybe you purposely want them to work with a different language. So you're not with someone with your first language, in which case you make that a 4 o'clock partner, etc. Maybe same number of years in the country. Lots of different options here. You can choose how you do the clock, but the idea of the clock, the purpose of the clock is to be strategic about making sure your students are working with someone who is going to help them to be able to learn, or either that maybe they're the teacher, maybe they're the one learning from the one that's a little bit further along, or maybe they're equally matched. But you've given it some thought beyond just turn to the person next to you. If you choose to use a clock like this, the pro tip is just make sure you make a master copy for yourself so you know what you did. Because that would be the worst if you did it and then you didn't remember who the 1 o'clock partners were, who the 2 o'clock partners were, et cetera. Because you're choosing these based on what your goals are for that particular activity. Okay, let's move along. Step 3 is we're going to differentiate our activities. So once we get into these groups, let's say you do a like ability group where you know, okay, these students are both at a similar readiness level in writing. What am I going to do? Well, the idea of differentiation is that we want to do the same activity, but different levels of difficulty. You, as a teacher, you don't have time to come up with a different lesson for every single level that's in your classroom. It's just, it's not possible. And so instead, what I'm going to encourage you to do is to think about how can you take your existing lesson and modify it in ways that help address different needs in the room. And so just as an easy example, I often do an information gap activity, which is where I have one student looking at a drawing, for example, like this fox here. So one student's looking at the image, the other student doesn't know what the first student is looking at, and they have to communicate with each other to figure it out. And usually I have the second student draw what it is that they think they're hearing. And so they have to talk to each other. And this is a very common language acquisition strategy, information gap. But what I know is that I have some students that need a very simple drawing, that's going to be the best they can do is just to describe something very simple. And I may have some students that need more of a challenge. They could do something a lot more complex. And so it's the same activity. We're still doing an information gap activity, but as I go around the room, I may hand, one group a more simple drawing to describe, and I may hand another group that I know that's ready for the challenge a much more complicated picture. Students don't even realize that I'm differentiating in that moment for them, but I'm just making that choice so that I can make sure that they're being successful in the activity. Another way that you can take one activity and then adjust it up or down. So here's just, again, this is from Venture's curriculum, but anything like this could be, this is a simple matching game. We've got a bracelet and a picture of a bracelet, gloves and a picture of gloves, a hat, a picture of a hat. So that's the existing activity. You already have that in your curriculum or something like it. And so the idea, the typical on-level activity is to take all cards, put them face down, and then you turn over 2 cards and you take turns trying to make a match. That's kind of the typical way to do it. But then as you go into your lesson, you can think, how can I make this more complex? Because for some of my students, they need more of a challenge. They're going to be done with that in 3 seconds, and then they have nothing to do. And so I always make sure whatever activity that I have my students working on, that I have thought ahead of time, how am I going to make this more complex for those that need more? And so there's a million ways to do this, and you're probably thinking of some right now. But one is that you could remove all the word cards, just put the pictures face down, have students pull the card and say and write the word. So now they don't have a word bank in front of them. They're having to remember all of this vocabulary, and they're also having to write it from memory. So that just takes the challenge level up a notch. So that's one way to differentiate this activity if I know that there's a group that needs a challenge. But also, I always make sure that I have a way to make it more comprehensible. That is, how do I make this a little bit easier, a little bit more doable for my students. And so maybe if I know that I have some students that are not going to be able to remember all 10 of these vocabulary words, maybe they've missed the last 2 times in class and have not been coming regularly. If I know I've got some students that are going to be in that situation, then I may say, you know what, 10 is too much. Let's just do 5. Maybe I'll make it self-correcting by writing an answer on the back of every one. So that way, when they turn over a bracelet and they look at the picture of the bracelet, they may not be sure if they have the right answer. So I make it self-correcting where they turn it over and see the word bracelet and they say, oh, bracelet, bracelet, that's a match. And so this can be applied to anything that you're doing. Any activity that you have, you can take it and think, how do I make this more complex? How do I make it more comprehensible? And then as you make your groups, you have basically 3 activities that you can give to different groups based on their needs. I don't think it's realistic to make a custom lesson plan for every person in the room. I don't think Tomlinson does either. And so instead, the idea is we try to put groups together and that have similar needs and then adjust accordingly. You can also use pre-leveled materials if you don't want to make your own. One that I just want to mention that I like that's free is News in Levels. This is the news of the day, the daily news, and it's both written and the level 1 is all in present tense, very simple language, and there's audio that they can listen to the news as they're reading it. There is a level 2, which is slightly more complex, starts using past tense verbs, and then level 3, which is the highest level that there is. All of them with audio so they can listen and read at the same time. And so there's lots of pre-leveled materials out there, and this is one that I like to use with my students if I know that I have different ability levels in the classroom. We're all doing the same thing. Again, the goal here is to be able to read a news article together. That's all of us going up to the mountain. You know, we're all trying to get to the same place. That's the goal of the lesson. But I'm differentiating based on who's in the room. We're all taking slightly different paths. And lastly, the fourth and final easy button is, let's see, we've done so far to make sure that you're not doing it alone. So make sure that you're leveraging all the resources in your room, especially your other students, students teaching students. The second one is to use flexible groups. So be mindful about how we group students. And then the third one was to use differentiated activities. But the fourth one, and I think one of the most important, is to just foster student buy-in. And what I mean by that is early on when I started thinking about differentiation in my classrooms, I felt uncomfortable with it. In a K-12 classroom, I was a little bit more comfortable, but when you're working with adults, I thought, you know, how are adults going to feel if they recognize that they're being given a slightly different activity, a modified activity? How are they going to feel if they recognize that they're reading a level 1 news article instead of at level 3? Is that right? But what I realized was that I was approaching it from an equality kind of standpoint, which is the one on the left, where I wanted everyone to have the same thing. But if everyone has the same thing, not everyone is actually getting access to the curriculum. Whereas as the one on the right, the equity is when I gave everyone what they needed that was leveled appropriately for them, then everyone is able to learn. So that being said, I had to get my own buy-in. I had to be bought in myself that this was a good idea. And then I had to buy in, get my students to be on board as well. And so what I do with adult students is I offer them a choice with leveled materials. So it is not very often that I will just say, hey, here I have 3 different activities, kind of an easy, medium, and hard, and this one is the one that you're going to do. Instead, I offer a choice to them and say, I have these activities. Which one would you like to do? And what I find is that adult learners are usually pretty self-aware. They usually will choose pretty well. Although I also find that once they make that choice and I'm able to see how they did working with that particular level of material, then I can maybe encourage them the next time. If I see that they could move up a level, if I see that they could use a challenge, I'll encourage them as they're making their choice, but I try to leave the choice to them. This helps save face for students who may feel embarrassed Fane, completely agree with you that choice boards are a wonderful way to do that as well. Voice and choice. Student agency is so key here. We want students to feel empowered in their learning. And so I don't want to take away their agency by telling them which worksheet that I'm going to have them do or which activity is right. But I likely, if it's obvious to the class that there are different versions, that we have slightly different materials or activities available, and that one's a little bit easier and one's a little bit more challenging, I'll usually explain the why. Why am I doing that? Generally, if students understand why, then they'll go along with what I'm doing because they recognize that I'm doing it to help them learn. And then I have them use self-assessment to make adjustments. So after they have participated in an activity, you can use something easy like emojis to see, hey, how did that go? And if they're, the happy emoji, I think I got this, great. If they're kind of in that thinking emoji saying, I need more practice, I don't know, I'm kind of in the middle, that helps you to know whether they chose well, or whether they need more or less support and scaffolds. And then if they're crying emoji, obviously that tells you probably need to provide a little bit different materials for them next time. Or you may need to group them differently, but it just gives you information so you know what to do next. I'm also really careful about how I name the levels. So in some curriculum, you will see this discussed as on level, above level, and below level. And that can be really discouraging kind of way to frame it. And so I have tried a lot of different words over the years when I've used these different types of materials. I've tried easy, medium, and hard, and that works. But unfortunately, when you say something's hard, it sounds hard. And so not everyone's going to pick the hard one. And so I'm going to encourage you to think about if you have different levels of materials in your classroom, if you have activities that you've adjusted to be more comprehensible or more complex, that you try to frame it in a positive way. So some that I've tried are almost there, got it, and feeling strong. You can also use lots of other creative ideas. You could use sports words like rookie, pro, Hall of Famer. You could use Olympics words like bronze, silver, and gold. You could use comparative words and do a little bit of grammar, good, better, and best. Spice levels like mild, medium, and hot. And that's a great culture lesson in and of itself. So, just be mindful as you name levels of materials if you do have different activities going. Okay, so those are our 4 kind of easy buttons. Again, I don't want to say this is easy because it's not. I teach in these classrooms. I know how hard this is. But these are some things that make it easier. And so I'd like you to just reflect right here at the end of the 4 things we talked about. Is there something you want to start doing? Is there something you want to stop doing? Is there something we talked about today that you want to explore further? I noticed that there were I couldn't fully keep up with the chat, but I noticed there were some people offering so much wisdom and experience and expertise about different resources that they have used and recommend. And so not only what I talked about today, but maybe someone gave a recommendation in the chat that you want to explore further. But just take a second to reflect on what do you want to do with this information? And where do you need to start? Do you just need to start by don't do it alone, just using groups in general? Do you want to try varying the types of groups that you use where you're more strategic about who is working with whom? Do you want to try to differentiate your activities a little bit? Now, you don't want to it's just too much to do every activity and multiple levels all the time. Start with one, try one. And then if you're successful there, then build up a repertoire to where you can add this into your teaching. And then lastly, do you need to foster student buy-in to help your students understand? So I wonder if in our last 5 minutes, I'm curious if there are any questions, any ideas that you'd like to share, again, because we've got some wonderful expertise in the room, so we'd love to hear from you. And then as we're doing that, just here's my contact information if you need me in the future. Okay, what questions do we have? Let's see. Well, okay, just a couple technical questions. There is a recording available, I believe, Bethel, is that right? Will this recording be available?
Yes, it will. The recording will be posted on our website, and then it will also be sent to everyone that registered as well.
Perfect. Okay, so yes, the recording is available and the PDF of the slides is available if you'd like to go back through, and if you think you want to use those clock partners, but you can't remember exactly how it works, you can go back and reference that slide. So that's absolutely right. There's a question here about using HighFlex, this in HighFlex situations. So we have in the world of online teaching, we have hybrid, we have fully online, we have asynchronous and synchronous, and sometimes we have HighFlex, where the way that I interpret that is that you have some students in the room with you and some students who are online. The best way I have seen grouping work in a HighFlex situation, and it requires infrastructure to be able to do it, but what they have done is they have put one student on one tablet. So everyone who's online is on their own tablet. And as soon as they each are on their own tablet, they can become mobile. And so when you make small groups, you have the in-person people working together, and then you have the tablet joining them, and that becomes their small group. And so I love that way of thinking. It's a wonderful way to do HighFlex, where you can do these types of groups where it's not just online people together and face-to-face people together, but you're blending online and face-to-face. But it does require that you have enough infrastructure or technology to be able to do it well. Great question. Yes, Michelle says, good ideas, adjuncts that teach part-time. It's so hard to justify the time that it takes to do all of this. And I agree. I have been an adjunct. I am very familiar with that's like. And so I'd encourage you in that situation, again, when you think about lesson planning, what I do is the tried and true things that I know I have always worked in my classrooms. I just take one of those things that I know this is a good lesson and I know this is a good activity. And then from there, I think, is there a way that I could, if a student finishes early or a group finishes early, how could I challenge them? So they do the regular activity, and I just always make sure that in my mind, I have something to challenge them. And then I always make sure when we start working in small groups that I go to those that need more support first, so that because I know they're going to need that additional one-on-one. So those are things that don't take a lot of prep time, but can still be very effective. And you're still using those same materials you've always used, not having to reinvent the wheel. I totally understand about the concern about time. Okay, it looks like we are out of time. I appreciate you guys so much. This chat is going so fast, I can't keep up, but know that you are appreciated. Know that Rome was not built in a day. It is a challenge to do this work and to do it well. But the fact that you're here at all today and wanting to learn more about it speaks volumes about how much you care about your students. So thank you for everything that you do.
Thank you so much, Katie. Thank you everyone for joining us. If you could take the poll before you leave. Also, you will get your certificate for the webinar within 24 hours following the beginning of the webinar. So look for that tomorrow afternoon, and everyone have a great weekend. Thanks so much.
Thanks. Bye.